Yesterday afternoon, a federal forecast office did something it almost never does. It drew an extreme heat warning across the entire state of Florida, not for tomorrow, but for a week to 2 weeks from now. And the most alarming line in it was not about the afternoon at all. It was 4 words. Little overnight relief expected. The forecasters are not worried about how hot the day gets. They're worried about a night that refuses to cool, and the reason points straight at the ocean wrapped around the state, water sitting at near record warmth before summer has even peaked. What that water does next is the whole story. If you want to understand what is actually coming, hit subscribe and stay with me, because we follow the signals other channels skip right past. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from, and whether your nights have actually been cooling off this week or staying warm long after dark. You will want to be here for this one. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The forecast that shouldn't exist yet. There is a kind of weather map that forecasters almost never draw this far in advance, and yesterday afternoon they drew one over the entire state of Florida. On the 10th of June, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon Eastern Time, the Climate Prediction Center released what is called a Days 8 to 14 Hazards Outlook. It is exactly what it sounds like. It is a map of what the country is likely to face, not tomorrow, not this weekend, but a week to 2 weeks from now, and across nearly the whole Florida peninsula, from the Panhandle down through the Everglades and all the way to Miami, they shaded in a single hazard in a deep, unmistakable red. Extreme heat. Valid June 18th through the 24th. Now your first instinct is probably the obvious one. Florida is hot in June. Of course it is. That is not a headline, that is a calendar, and if all this were about the afternoon being warm, you would be completely right to scroll past it. But that is not what this forecast says, and the difference between what you assume it says and what it actually says is the entire reason you are watching this video. Because the part of that outlook that should stop you is not the high temperature at all. It is one short sentence near the bottom, written in the flat, careful language these agencies always use, and it reads like this. Little overnight relief expected, with record high minimum temperatures possible. Read that again, because everything that follows comes out of it. Not record highs, record high minimums. The lowest the temperature is expected to fall is what they are flagging. The forecasters are not worried about how hot the afternoon gets. They're worried about how hot the night refuses to stop being. And that single shift, from the ceiling of the day to the floor of the night, is the difference between a normal Florida summer and something that genuinely alarms the people whose job is to not be alarmed. Let me show you why the timing alone is strange, before we even get to the heat. A days. 8 to 14 outlook lives in the hardest part of the entire forecasting business. Predicting tomorrow is relatively easy. The atmosphere has momentum, and the patterns you can see right now are mostly the patterns you will get. But a week to 2 weeks out, that momentum has scattered into noise. Tiny errors in today's measurements grow into enormous errors down the line, and most of the time, by the time you reach day 10, the honest forecast is a shrug. The models disagree, the signal drowns in the chaos. That is the normal state of affairs at this range, and any forecaster will tell you so. So when the Climate Prediction Center is willing to take an entire state and paint it with a 40 to 60% probability of extreme heat, a week to 2 weeks before it arrives, that is not them being dramatic. That is them telling you something quietly important. It means the signal is strong enough to punch through all that noise. It means whatever is driving this is not some delicate little weather feature that might wobble away by next Tuesday. It is something big, something slow, something with so much mass and momentum behind it that the models can see it coming from 2 weeks out and barely disagree. And in the atmosphere, the things that behave like that, the things you can forecast that far ahead with that much confidence, are almost never the air by itself. They are usually the ocean. Hold on to that idea, because it is the spine of this whole story, and we are going to come back to it again and again. The forecast is not really a forecast about the sky, it is a forecast about the water, and the way the probability is written tells you the same thing if you know how to read it. The outlook does not say extreme heat is certain. It puts the odds at 40 to 60%, and across an entire state. That range is a strong signal at this lead time. Think about what a probability forecast actually is. It is the forecaster's honest accounting of how confident they can be given everything that could still go differently between now and then. At a range of 8 to 14 days for most hazards, That confidence is so low that the responsible thing is to say nothing specific at all. So when an agency is willing to commit to a 40 to 60% chance of a hazard as serious as extreme heat over a whole peninsula more than a week out, they are effectively saying that the underlying driver is so dominant that even after accounting for everything they cannot know, the odds still come out this high. That is not hedging. In the language of long-range forecasting, that is a shout. And again, the only kind of driver that produces that much confidence at that much lead time is a slow, massive, high-inertia one. The kind that lives in the ocean, not the sky. The outlook itself ties the heat to what it calls mid-level high pressure. That is the meteorological machinery, and we will take it apart properly in a moment. But notice what the agency chose to emphasize when they wrote the public summary. They said the heat index, the combination of temperature and humidity that describes what the air actually feels like on your skin, may exceed 105 degrees. They said little overnight relief. They said record high minimum temperatures possible. 3 statements, and 2 of the 3 are about the night. The people who issued this warning are pointing their flashlight at the dark hours, and they are doing it for a reason that has almost nothing to do with the afternoon sun. Here is something worth sitting with. We have a deep, almost instinctive relationship with the idea that the night is when things cool off. It is built into the language. We talk about the cool of the evening, about sleeping it off, about the relief that comes after sundown. For your entire life, and your parents' entire lives, and every generation before that. The deal has been simple. The day heats up, the sun goes down, the land lets go of its heat, and the temperature falls. The night is the recovery. The night is the reset. It is the single most reliable rhythm in the entire system. So reliable that we never think about it, the way you never think about the floor being there when you step out of bed. And what the Climate Prediction Center is telling you, in that one careful sentence, is that for a week in late June, across the state of Florida, that floor may not be there. The reset may not come. The night may refuse to do the one thing the night has always done. And if you want to understand why that is so much more dangerous than a hot afternoon, and why it points directly at the ocean rather than the sky, you have to understand what is supposed to happen after dark and why, in Florida, it increasingly does not. That is where we are going next, and once you see the mechanism, you will not be able to unsee it. Because the reason Florida cannot cool down at night is not really about Florida at all. It is about what is touching it on every side. Part 2. Why the land cools and Florida can't. To understand what is about to go wrong, you first have to understand what normally goes right, and it comes down to a simple piece of physics that governs every clear night on Earth. During the day, the sun pours energy onto the ground, and the ground warms up. That part is obvious. But the ground is also doing something the entire time, day and night, that you cannot see. It is glowing. Not in visible light, but in infrared, the long, invisible wavelengths of heat. Everything warm radiates this way. Your body does it. The pavement does it. The soil in a field does it. And on a clear night, with no sun pouring energy back in, that invisible glow keeps streaming upward, off the land and out through the atmosphere, and into the cold blackness of space. The ground is literally shedding its heat to the universe. That is why the temperature falls at night. That is the reset. That is the floor. Now here is the thing about land. Land cools fast because land is, in a sense, shallow. The sun only heats the top layer of soil and rock during the day, maybe a few inches that really change temperature. So when night falls and that thin warm skin starts radiating its heat away, there is not much heat stored underneath to replace it. The land empties out quickly. Think about a desert, which is almost all land and almost no water. A desert can be blistering at 2 in the afternoon and genuinely cold by 2 in the morning, a swing of 40 or 50 degrees in a single night. That enormous drop is the land doing exactly what land does. It grabs heat fast and it gives it back fast. The floor of the night, in a desert, is a long way down. Water does not work this way, and the difference is not small. It is the whole story. Water has what physicists call a high heat capacity, which is a technical way of saying that water is enormously reluctant to change its temperature. You have felt this your entire life without naming it. A swimming pool stays cold well into the summer even after weeks of hot days, and then it stays warm well into the autumn even after the air has turned cold. The ocean does the same thing on a planetary scale. It takes a staggering amount of energy to warm a body of water even slightly, and once that water is warm, it holds that warmth with a kind of stubbornness that land can only dream of. Water is a battery, land is a paper cup. One of them empties the instant you stop pouring. The other holds its charge for months. This is the same physics that, in normal times, makes coastal places so pleasant to live in. A town on the coast usually has milder days and milder nights than a town 100 miles inland, because the nearby water acts like a giant thermostat, soaking up heat when the air is hot and releasing it when the air is cool, smoothing out the extremes. The ocean's reluctance to change temperature is the very thing that gives coastal climates their gentle, even character. People move to the shore for exactly this reason, for the way the sea takes the edge off both the heat and the cold. But that same thermostat has a dark side, and it only shows up when the water itself becomes abnormally warm. A thermostat set to a comfortable temperature keeps you comfortable. A thermostat that has been pushed to a near-record high setting does the opposite. It stops smoothing the heat away and starts holding it in, because the reservoir it is regulating toward is now hot. The mechanism that normally protects the coast becomes the mechanism that traps it, and the gentler the climate used to be, the more shocking the reversal feels when the water turns. And this is where Florida's geography stops being a postcard and starts being a trap. Look at the shape of the place. Florida is not a chunk of continent. It is a long, thin peninsula, a finger of low land reaching south into the sea, with the Gulf of Mexico pressing against its entire western flank, and the Atlantic Ocean against its entire eastern one, and the warm shallows of the Florida Bay and the straits wrapping around the bottom. There is almost no point in the southern half of the state that is more than 70 or 80 miles from salt water, and most of it is far closer. Florida is not land surrounded by a little water. It is functionally a sandbar inside a bathtub of ocean. So ask yourself what happens at night to a place like that. On the land itself, the same physics tries to play out. The ground tries to radiate its heat to space, tries to cool down, tries to bring the floor down the way it always has. But the air sitting over Florida is not isolated. It is in constant contact, constant exchange, with the enormous mass of warm water on every side. As the land tries to cool, the sea breeze and the simple mixing of the lower atmosphere keep dragging in air that has been sitting over water that is not cooling at all, because water does not empty out overnight the way land does. The ocean cannot shed its heat to space the way a desert can, because that heat is not sitting in a thin skin at the surface. It is stored deep in the water column, a vast reservoir that the night is far too short to drain, and so the warm marine air keeps flowing in, keeps mixing down, and keeps propping the temperature up from below. The floor of the night in Florida is being held up by the ocean's hand. There is a second mechanism stacked right on top of that one, and it makes the night even worse, and it is the humidity. All that warm water is constantly evaporating, loading the air over Florida with water vapor. You know this as the mugginess, the thickness, the way the air in South Florida in summer feels like something you wear rather than something you breathe. But water vapor is not just uncomfortable. It is, in physics terms, a greenhouse gas, and a powerful one. That invisible infrared glow that the land is trying to send out to space, the water vapor in the air catches a great deal of it and sends it right back down. A dry desert sky is a wide open window through which the day's heat escapes. A humid Florida sky is a closed, fogged-up pane that traps the heat against the ground. So not only is the ocean feeding warm air in from the sides, the moisture in that air is slamming the window shut overhead. The land cannot radiate its heat away because the sky will not let it. Put those two things together, and you arrive at the reason the Climate Prediction Center wrote that one careful sentence about record-high minimum temperatures. In a normal place, on a normal night, the land radiates, the temperature falls, and the body of everything living there gets its recovery. In Florida, under the conditions building toward late June, the ocean holds the floor up from below, while the humidity holds the lid down from above, and the temperature gets caught in between, unable to fall the way it is supposed to. The afternoon high is almost beside the point. It is the refusal of the night to let go that defines the danger, and the engine behind both of those mechanisms, the warm air and the trapped heat alike, is the same single thing. It is the temperature of the water wrapped around the state. Which raises the only question that actually matters now. Just how warm is that water? because if the whole mechanism runs on the heat stored in the Gulf and the Atlantic, then everything depends on the state of that reservoir right now in June, before the summer has even reached its peak. And when you go and look at what the ocean around Florida is actually doing this year, the picture stops being a routine summer forecast and starts being something that the forecasters very deliberately flagged 2 weeks early. That is what we have to look at next. Part 3. The water is the story. Let's go straight to the water, because by now you understand that the water is the whole game, and the numbers coming out of the ocean around Florida this year are not normal. As of the middle of May 2026, sea surface temperatures across the Gulf of Mexico were running at near record levels. Not warm for the date, not a little above average, tied with the same date in 2024 for the warmest that stretch of ocean has ever been recorded, more than 1 full degree Celsius above the 1991 to 2020 average. And I want to be careful here, because 1 degree Celsius sounds small, the kind of number you would ignore on a thermostat. But you are not heating a room, you are heating an ocean basin, a volume of water so immense that nudging its average temperature up by a single degree represents an amount of stored energy that is difficult for the human mind to hold. Remember the battery. A 1 degree rise across the entire Gulf is a battery charged to a level it has essentially never reached this early in the year. The term scientists use for this is a marine heat wave, and it is worth understanding that it is the ocean's version of exactly the thing we fear on land. We all know what a heat wave on land is, a stretch of abnormally hot days. A marine heat wave is the same idea applied to the sea, a prolonged period during which a patch of ocean runs far hotter than it normally would for that time of year. And the reason marine heat waves are in some ways more consequential than the ones on land comes straight back to that battery analogy. A heat wave in the air can break in an afternoon when a front rolls through. A marine heat wave does not break that easily, because the ocean's enormous heat capacity means that once that water is hot, it stays hot for weeks or months, shrugging off the kind of short-term weather changes that would end a land heat wave overnight. So when we say the water around Florida is in a near-record marine heat wave, we are not describing a passing condition that might clear by next week. We are describing a settled state of the ocean, a reservoir that has been charging for months and will hold that charge through the heart of the summer, which is precisely why it can sit underneath a forecast issued 2 weeks in advance and not move. The land's heat comes and goes with the weather, the sea's heat stays, and that staying power is the whole reason it can dictate the season, and the Gulf is only half of it. Out in the broader North Atlantic off Florida's eastern shoulder, there has been a persistent marine heat wave, a large patch of ocean running far hotter than it should, and the forecast through the summer of 2026 is for that western Atlantic warmth to expand and strengthen and fold the Gulf into it, so that the entire body of water wrapped around the Florida peninsula becomes one continuous reservoir of near-record heat. To give you a sense of scale, the global coverage of marine heat waves, the fraction of the world's ocean surface that qualifies as being in one, sat around 27% this spring and is forecast to climb toward 40% by the third quarter of the year. Roughly 4 out of every 10 square miles of ocean on the planet, abnormally hot at the same time. Florida just happens to be sitting in the middle of one of the hottest patches. So now connect it back to the night, because this is where the forecast and the physics lock together. The Climate Prediction Center is looking out a week to 2 weeks and saying Florida's overnight temperatures may not fall, may set records for how high they stay. And the reason they can say that with enough confidence to paint an entire state red 2 weeks out is that they are not really forecasting the air. They are reading the ocean. The water is already loaded. The reservoir that holds the floor of the night up from below is already at a level it normally does not reach until the very peak of summer, if it reaches it at all. When the mid-level high pressure they mentioned settles over the state, and the winds go light and the sky clears, there is nothing left to bring the nighttime temperature down, because the thing that would have to cool, the surrounding sea, is hotter than almost any June on record. The forecast is confident because the ocean is the kind of slow, massive, high-momentum system that you actually can see coming from 2 weeks away. The water is doing the forecasting. The forecasters are just reading it out loud. I told you we would keep coming back to the spine of this, and here it is in its clearest form. The heat that is about to settle over Florida is not a land event. It is an ocean event that happens to be expressing itself over land. The rest of the country this spring has been hit by what you might call honest heat domes, the land-driven kind. A ridge of high pressure parks over the dry interior. The sun bakes the ground, and at night the dry land radiates its heat to a clear sky, and the temperature falls, sometimes dramatically. We covered exactly that kind of pattern just a couple of days ago. The first big heat wave of the summer marching across the country with its record afternoon highs. That is the continental version. What is about to happen in Florida is a different animal entirely, because Florida cannot do the nighttime part. The land-driven heat dome has a release valve every night. The ocean-driven Florida version does not, and a heat event with no nightly release is not just a hotter version of the same thing. It is a categorically more dangerous thing, and we are going to see exactly why when we look at what a night that never cools does to a human body. There is a recent memory that tells you how far this can go, and it happened in the very same water 3 years ago. In late July of 2023, a buoy sitting in Manatee Bay, in the shallow water near Everglades National Park at the bottom of the peninsula, recorded a sea temperature of 101.1 degrees Fahrenheit. 101.1. That is not air temperature. That is the temperature of the ocean itself, water you could have been standing in, hotter than a heated swimming pool, hotter than a hot tub is usually set, measured in the open environment off the coast of Florida. It was widely described at the time as possibly the hottest sea surface temperature ever reliably recorded anywhere on Earth. Now there is an honest caveat, and because this channel does not inflate things, I will give it to you straight. That particular buoy sits in very shallow, murky, sediment-darkened water, the kind of spot that heats up more than the open ocean would, so scientists were careful not to crown it an official open water world record. But the caveat does not soften the point, it sharpens it. The water around Florida is capable of reaching temperatures that, a generation ago, would have sounded like a typo. And that same 2023 marine heatwave did something that should function as a warning we have already been given. Down in the Florida Keys, at a coral restoration site called Sombrero Reef, the heat hit so hard and so fast that one of the organizations working there reported 100% coral mortality. Everything dead. An entire reef section wiped out, not over decades, but in the span of a single hot season, because the water got too warm for the living things inside it to survive. Coral is, in a way, the ocean's thermometer with a conscience. It tells you not just how hot the water got, but whether the heat crossed a line that life on the other side of it could not come back from. And in 2023, in this exact water, the answer was yes. So when we talk about Florida's nights not cooling in late June of 2026, understand that we are not talking about an abstract forecast. We are talking about the same reservoir that hit 101 degrees and killed a reef, now sitting at near-record warmth again, this time even earlier in the season, with a high-pressure system about to clamp down on top of it, and a federal agency confident enough to flag it 2 weeks out. The water is the story. The water has always been the story. And the next question is the one that turns this from a weather report into something that touches every person living down there. What does a night that never cools actually do to the people trying to sleep through it? Because the body, it turns out, depends on that nightly reset far more than you realise, and when it disappears, the consequences arrive quietly in the dark when no one is watching the thermometer. Part 4. The night that will not end. Your body runs a daily cycle that you almost never think about, and the night is the most important part of it. Across the course of a day, your core temperature rises and falls on a gentle rhythm, and it is supposed to drop in the evening, settling into a cooler trough during sleep. That nightly cooling is not a luxury. It is how the cardiovascular system gets its break. During a hot day, your heart works harder, your blood vessels dilate to push blood toward the skin where heat can escape. You sweat, you lose fluid and salt, and the whole system runs under load. The night is when all of that is supposed to stand down. The air cools, your body sheds the day's accumulated heat, your heart rate falls, and the machinery recovers so it can do it all again tomorrow. The night is the maintenance window. It is when the repairs happen. Now take that recovery away. Hold the temperature up through the entire night, the way the ocean and the humidity are about to hold it up over Florida, and the body never gets to stand down. The heart keeps working through the dark hours. The core temperature never settles into its cool trough. You wake up already behind, already depleted, and you start the next hot day without ever having recovered from the last one. Do that for one night and you are tired and irritable. Do it for 3 or 4 nights in a row, which is exactly what a stalled high-pressure system over warm water produces, and the strain compounds. The danger is cumulative. It builds across the nights, not across the afternoons. This is the reason heat is the deadliest form of extreme weather in the United States. Deadlier than hurricanes, deadlier than tornadoes, deadlier than floods, and it kills in a way that almost no one sees. A tornado leaves a scar you can photograph. Heat leaves an elderly man who went to sleep in an apartment where the air would not cool, and whose heart, already strained, simply gave out somewhere in the small hours. It does not look like a disaster. It looks like a quiet death from natural causes, and it is only when you count them all up at the end of a season that the true scale appears. And the single most reliable predictor of when these deaths spike is not the daytime high at all. It is the nighttime low. It is the overnight minimum that will not fall, which is precisely, exactly, the variable the Climate Prediction Center chose to flag when they drew that map over Florida. They did not warn about record highs. They warned about record high minimums because the people who study this know that the floor of the night is where the bodies are counted. There is a second layer that makes the cities worse than the countryside, and it has a name. It is called the urban heat island. A city is built of asphalt and concrete and brick and steel, materials that soak up the sun's heat all day long and then, just like the ocean but on a smaller scale, release it slowly through the night. A downtown can run several degrees warmer after dark than the rural land around it, because the city itself has become a battery of stored heat, radiating it back into the streets and the apartments long after sundown. Now drop that city onto a peninsula surrounded by record warm water, where the night already refuses to cool, and you have stacked 2 heat traps on top of each other. The ocean holds the regional floor up, and the concrete holds the neighborhood floor up even higher. The hottest, most dangerous place to be on one of these nights is an upper floor apartment in an urban core with no working air conditioning, where the heat of the city and the heat of the sea combine and simply sit there until morning. Miami knows this better than almost any city in the country, because Miami has already lived through the version of this that the forecast is now pointing toward. In the record warm summer of 2023, the heat index in Miami reached 105 degrees or higher on 40 separate days between the 1st of June and the 1st of September. 40 days. The city accumulated more than 100 hours at that oppressive level, and it ran a streak of 46 consecutive days where the feels-like temperature touched the triple digits. That is a month and a half without a single day of real relief. And Miami took that threat seriously enough that, back in 2021, it did something no other city in the world had done. It appointed a chief heat officer, a single official whose entire job is to treat heat as the deadly hazard it is, to map which neighborhoods and which people are most vulnerable, to lower the thresholds at which warnings go out, and to get cooling to the people who need it before the nights start stacking up. And here is the part that matters, the part that keeps this from being a story of pure doom, because this channel does not deal in helplessness. It worked. Despite those brutal conditions, the officially attributed heat death count in Miami's county stayed remarkably low, in the single digits, while other hot places without those systems counted their heat-related deaths in the hundreds. In that same period, one county in Arizona attributed more than 600 deaths to heat, and the states of Texas and Nevada counted hundreds more. Miami, hammered by heat that should have been catastrophic, kept its toll down to a handful because someone treated the nighttime floor as a threat worth building a system around. That is the proof that this hazard, unlike an earthquake or a hurricane, is one we can actually do something about if we understand what we are looking at. But the systems only work if people understand why the night matters, and that is exactly the understanding that tends to be missing, because we are all still operating on the old assumption that the night takes care of itself. Consider what actually happens to a body across several of these nights in a row, because the cruelty of it is in the accumulation. After one flawless night, you're tired, your resting heart rate is a little elevated, you're slightly dehydrated from sweating through the dark. Annoying, but survivable. After the second night with no real cooling, you start the day already in deficit, and the heat of that second day digs the hole deeper, and the second night fails to fill it back in. By the third and fourth night, For a person whose heart was already working near its limit, the margin is gone. The cardiovascular system has been running under continuous load for days with no maintenance window. The body's ability to regulate its own temperature begins to falter, and the stage is set for the kind of quiet overnight failure that shows up later in the statistics as a death from heart disease rather than from heat. This is why the duration of these events matters as much as their peak. A single hot day is a stress. 4 consecutive nights that will not cool is a siege, and the people it breaks are the ones with the least reserve to begin with. The elderly living alone, the chronically ill, the poor in buildings without working air conditioning, the very groups a warm night targets most precisely and most invisibly. So that is what the heat does to the people. But remember what we established about the source of all this. The danger to human bodies on those Florida nights comes from the warmth of the surrounding sea. And that same warm sea, that same enormous reservoir of stored ocean heat that is about to make sleep dangerous in Miami, is the exact same reservoir that the most violent storms on Earth feed on. The heat that will not let the night cool is hurricane fuel. It is the same energy, sitting in the same water, waiting to be spent, and whether the ocean spends it slowly as relentless heat, or all at once as a storm, is the question that turns this single week in June into a preview of the entire summer ahead. Part 5. The fuel underneath the heat. A hurricane is, at its core, a heat engine, and the fuel it burns is warm ocean water. That is not a metaphor, it is the literal physics of the thing. A tropical storm forms and grows by drawing warm, moist air up off the surface of the sea. As that air rises and the water vapour in it condenses into clouds and rain, it releases an immense amount of latent heat, the energy that was stored when the water evaporated off the warm ocean in the first place. That released heat warms the core of the storm, lowers the pressure, and pulls in even more warm, moist air from the surface, which rises, condenses, releases more heat, and drives the whole cycle harder. It is a feedback loop, a self-feeding fire, and the thing it eats is the warmth of the water underneath it. And like any fire, it grows in proportion to how much fuel it can reach. Starve it of warm water and it gutters and dies. Give it an ocean charge to near-record warmth, reaching deep below the surface, and there is no natural limit on how hot the engine can run, except the wind that might tear it apart from above. That is the entire reason the temperature of the sea is not a side detail in hurricane season. It is the fuel supply, and the fuller it is, the higher the ceiling on what the engine can become. The warmer the sea, the more fuel available, the more violently the engine can run. Forecasters have long used a rough rule of thumb that the surface needs to be around 80 degrees Fahrenheit or warmer for a hurricane to sustain itself. The Gulf and the Western Atlantic this year are sitting well past that, near record warm, with energy to spare. But the surface temperature is only the first layer of the problem, and the deeper layer is the one that should concern you more. What actually determines how strong a hurricane can get is not just how hot the very top of the ocean is, but how deep that warm water goes. This is a quantity scientists call ocean heat content, and it is the part of the picture the surface map does not show you. Here is why it matters. As a hurricane churns over the sea, its winds stir the water violently, dragging up cooler water from below and mixing it toward the surface. If the warm layer is shallow, with cold water just beneath it, the storm essentially pulls up its own cold blanket, chills the surface beneath itself, and chokes off its own fuel supply. But if the warm water runs deep, layer after layer of it stored down through the water column, then no amount of churning reaches anything cold. The storm just keeps finding more fuel the harder it digs. And deep, warm ocean heat content is exactly what near-record sea temperatures, built up over many months, produce. The battery is not just charged on the surface, it is charged all the way down. The history of Gulf hurricanes is, in large part, the history of storms finding that deep warm water at the wrong moment. Some of the most frightening landfalls the United States has ever recorded were storms that were unremarkable a day or two before they came ashore. Ordinary systems that crossed a patch of deep warm water in the Gulf and underwent rapid intensification, leaping 1, 2, even 3 categories of strength in the final day before landfall, giving the people in their path almost no time to react to what was actually coming. That is the signature nightmare of Gulf forecasting, the storm that is one thing when you go to bed and a monster when you wake up, And the ingredient that makes it possible is precisely the deep ocean heat content we have been describing. A shallow, warm layer cannot do it, because the storm churns up cold water and chokes. A deep, warm layer, a loop current eddy in particular, removes the brake entirely and lets the engine run as hard as the physics will allow. So when you hear that the Gulf this year holds near record heat, reaching far down into the water column, understand that what that really means is that the conditions for the worst kind of surprise, the overnight explosion of a storm just before it reaches a coast, are more available this year than in almost any year on record. The fuel for the nightmare is in the tank. In the Gulf of Mexico, there is a specific feature that turns this from a general concern into a loaded mechanism, and it is called the loop current. The loop current is a river of warm water that flows up out of the Caribbean, loops north into the Gulf, and bends back out through the Florida Straits to join the Gulf Stream. It carries some of the deepest, warmest water in the entire basin. And every so often, the top of that loop pinches off and leaves behind a massive spinning eddy of deep, warm water, a self-contained whirlpool of high ocean heat content, sitting in the middle of the Gulf like a pool of gasoline. This year, the loop current shed one of those rings back in February and is now in a regrowth phase, extending northward again, in exactly the configuration that favours shedding another deep, warm eddy during the peak of hurricane season. If a storm crosses one of those eddies, it finds essentially unlimited fuel with no cold water underneath to slow it down, and that is the classic setup for the single most feared behaviour in tropical meteorology, which is rapid intensification, a storm exploding from a modest system into a monster in a matter of hours. So now you can see the two faces of the same thing. The warm water wrapped around Florida is, right now in June, refusing to let the nights cool, threatening the people trying to sleep through a heat wave. And that identical body of water, that identical stored heat, is the fuel that a hurricane would burn to tear the same coastline apart later in the season. It is one reservoir. It is one charge in the battery. The ocean can spend that energy slowly, leaking it into the air night after night as heat that will not break, or it can spend it all at once, dumping it into the core of a storm that crosses the Gulf in late summer. The heat wave and the hurricane are not two different stories. They are two different ways for the same ocean to spend the same energy. And that is exactly why a single week of forecast heat in the middle of June is telling you something about the whole 3 months ahead. It is a readout on how much fuel is in the tank, which is the moment where you might reasonably expect me to tell you that a record warm Gulf means a catastrophic hurricane season is locked in. And here is where the story turns and gets more interesting, because that is not what the forecasts say at all. In fact, the official outlooks for the 2026 hurricane season are calling for a quieter than normal year. That sounds at first like a contradiction. Record warm fuel, but a below normal forecast. How can both of those be true at the same time? The answer reveals something important about how these storms actually work, and about why a quiet forecast over a loaded ocean might be the most deceptive kind of calm there is. Because the thing holding the storms back this year is not the water, it is the wind, and winds can change. Part 6. Loaded gun, safety half on. To understand why a record warm ocean can sit underneath a below normal hurricane forecast, you have to know that warm water is necessary for a hurricane, but it is not sufficient. There is a second ingredient, and it works against the storms rather than for them, and it is called wind shear. Wind shear is the change in wind speed and direction as you go up through the atmosphere. A hurricane is a tall, vertically stacked engine, a column that needs to stand up straight to function, with its warm core neatly aligned from the surface all the way to the top. When there is strong wind shear, the upper part of that column gets blown sideways relative to the bottom, the structure tilts and tears, the warm core gets ventilated and disrupted, and the storm cannot organize. High shear is like a hand that keeps knocking the chimney over before the fire inside can really catch. You can have all the warm water in the world, but if the shear is high, the storms struggle to form and struggle to hold together. And this is where the Pacific reaches halfway around the planet to put its thumb on the Atlantic. We have talked on this channel more than once recently about the El Niño that has been building in the equatorial Pacific, with the ocean index sitting at plus 0.48 and climbing toward the threshold, the warming pattern that the forecasts say is likely to strengthen through the year. One of the most reliable things El Niño does is increase wind shear over the tropical Atlantic. The altered pattern of the atmosphere it sets up sends stronger upper-level winds across the basin, where hurricanes would otherwise grow, and that shear suppresses them. This is why both of the major 2026 seasonal forecasts call for a quieter year. The federal outlook calls for a below normal season, somewhere in the range of 8 to 14 named storms, 3 to 6 hurricanes, and 1 to 3 major hurricanes. The leading university forecast lands in a similar place, around 13 named storms, 6 hurricanes and 2 major ones, and both of them point to the same culprit. The developing El Niño, raising the shear, holding the storms down, even over water that is hot enough to feed monsters. It is worth pausing on how strange and how telling that reach is. A warming of the ocean surface in the central Pacific, thousands of miles away from Florida, on the other side of Mexico and Central America, ends up changing whether a hurricane can form in the Atlantic. The way it works is through the great atmospheric circulation loops that connect the tropics around the entire globe. When the Pacific warms in an El Niño, it shifts where the air rises and where it sinks across the whole tropical belt, and one downstream consequence is a change in the high-level winds over the Atlantic basin, strengthening the shear that tears storms apart. It is a reminder that these systems are not local. The ocean is one connected body, the atmosphere is one connected fluid, and a change in one corner of the planet propagates into the weather of another corner through machinery that operates on a scale almost impossible to picture. And that interconnection is exactly why a forecaster can look at the state of the Pacific and make a meaningful statement about the Atlantic hurricane season, and exactly why a near-record warm Gulf does not automatically translate into a record number of storms. The fuel is set by the local ocean. The trigger is governed, in part, by an ocean and ocean away. Both are loaded at once this year, pulling in opposite directions, the warm Gulf pushing toward intensity, and the warming Pacific pushing toward suppression, and the summer ahead is the resolution of that tension. So here is the trap in that reassurance, and I want to be very careful and very honest about it, because this is exactly the kind of place where it would be easy to either overhype or oversoothe, and neither one serves you. A below-normal forecast counts storms. It tells you how many are likely to form. It does not and cannot tell you how strong any single one of them will be if it does form, or where it will go. And underneath that quiet forecast sits a Gulf of Mexico loaded with near-record ocean heat content and a loop current spinning up its deep, warm eddies. The shear is a brake on the number of storms. It is not a brake on the intensity of the ones that slip through. All it takes is one system that finds a window where the shear relaxes for a couple of days, drifts over one of those deep, warm eddies in the Gulf, and rapidly intensifies on its way toward a coastline. The historical record is full of quiet seasons that produced one catastrophic storm, because the season's total count and the strength of its worst storm are almost unrelated numbers. This is one of the most misunderstood things about hurricane forecasting, and it is worth being very clear about, because the misunderstanding gets people hurt. When a seasonal outlook calls for a below-normal number of storms, it lands in the public ear as good news, as a quiet year, as a reason to relax. But the number of storms a season produces and the damage a season does are almost entirely different questions. A season can produce a long list of weak, fish-spinning systems that never touch land and rack up an impressive count while harming no one. And a season can produce just a handful of storms, one of which finds the worst possible combination of warm water, low shear, and a populated coastline, and becomes the disaster that everyone remembers for a generation. The count goes in the record book. The one storm goes in the history book. They are not the same measurement, and the forecast that predicts the first tells you very little about the second. What governs whether that one storm becomes a monster is not how many siblings it has. It is whether it crosses deep warm water during a lull in the shear on its way to land, and this year the deep warm water is laid out across the Gulf in near record supply, waiting for any system that wanders over it during a quiet window. So the responsible way to hear this season's forecast is not as a promise of safety, but as a statement about odds and fuel held in tension. The odds of any given storm forming are being suppressed by the Pacific's shear. The fuel available to any storm that does form is near record high. A low count over a loaded ocean is arguably a more treacherous setup than a high count over a cooler one, because the low count breeds complacency precisely, while the fuel for catastrophe sits fully stocked. The people who live along that coastline do not experience the season's storm count. They experience the one storm that reaches them, if one does, and that storm does not care that the season was forecast to be quiet. It only cares how warm the water was on the day it crossed, and the water this year is as warm as it has almost ever been. Think of it as a loaded gun with the safety only half on. The fuel is in place, more of it than almost any year on record, sitting in the water around Florida. The thing keeping the storms down is a pattern of wind, high in the atmosphere, driven by an ocean on the far side of the world, and wind patterns are exactly the kind of thing that can relax for a week at the wrong moment. We have already seen the season's opening gesture. The very first disturbance of 2026 showed up this month down in the Bay of Campeche, in the southwestern corner of the Gulf, a low-end system not expected to develop much before moving inland over Mexico. A small thing, easy to ignore. But it is the season clearing its throat, the first sign that the machinery is awake, over water that is hotter than it has almost ever been this early. So when you hear that this is forecast to be a quiet hurricane season, do not hear safety. Hear a loaded ocean held in check by a single variable that can change. The same heat that is about to deny Florida its nights in June is sitting in the tank for the rest of the summer, and whether it comes out slowly or all at once is not yet written. That is the real meaning of calling this a preview. The June heat is not the season. It is the gauge that tells you how much is stored, and the last piece we need before we can put the whole picture together is the human one. Because whether the threat arrives as a stalled heatwave or a sudden storm, it eventually comes down to a single question that the science has actually measured. How much can a human body take? And exactly where is the line past which warm, wet air stops being uncomfortable and starts being lethal? Part 7. The line. The body cannot cross. You have a cooling system built into your skin, and it is the reason you have survived every hot day of your life, and it works by evaporation. When you sweat, the water on your skin evaporates into the air, and evaporation carries heat away with it, pulling warmth off your body the same way it pulls warmth off the ocean. It is an elegant, ancient, extraordinarily effective system, and it has exactly one weakness. It only works if the air is dry enough to accept the sweat. The drier the air, the faster the evaporation, the more efficiently you cool. But as the air fills with water vapor, as the humidity climbs, evaporation slows down, because air that is already saturated cannot accept much more moisture, and at the extreme, when the air is hot and so soaked with water that evaporation nearly stops, your sweat just runs off you uselessly, your one cooling system fails, and your core temperature begins to climb with nothing to stop it. This is why humid heat is so much more dangerous than a dry one, and it is why Florida, of all places, sits closest to the edge. Scientists measure this danger with something called the wet bulb temperature, and the name comes from the instrument. You take a thermometer, wrap its bulb in a wet cloth and let air blow across it. The water evaporates off the cloth and cools the thermometer, exactly the way sweat cools your skin, and the temperature it settles at is the wet bulb temperature. In dry air, that wet bulb reading is far below the actual air temperature, because the evaporation is powerful. In saturated air, the wet bulb reading climbs toward the air temperature itself, because evaporation has almost stopped. The wet bulb temperature, in other words, is a direct measurement of how much cooling power the air will allow your body to have, and there is a hard ceiling built into it. For years, the figure scientists used for the absolute theoretical limit of human survivability was a wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees Celsius, which is 95 degrees Fahrenheit. The logic is brutal and simple. Your body holds its core at about 37 degrees Celsius. To shed heat, you need the environment to be cooler than you are, so the heat flows outward. If the wet bulb temperature reaches 35, the gap between your body and the environment's cooling capacity nearly closes, and you can no longer dump your own metabolic heat no matter what you do. Not with shade, not with a fan, not with unlimited water to drink. At a sustained wet bulb of 35, a healthy human in the open simply overheats and dies in a matter of hours, because the laws of physics will not let the body cool itself. That was the line on the map. That was the number. And then, just a few years ago, researchers did something that should have made far more headlines than it did. Instead of calculating the limit on paper, they measured it on real people in a controlled lab, putting young, healthy adults into carefully managed heat and humidity, and watching for the exact point at which their core temperatures began an unstoppable climb. And the line they found was not 35 degrees Celsius, it was lower. For these young, fit subjects, the real critical wet bulb threshold came in closer to 31 degrees Celsius, several degrees below the theoretical limit everyone had been using. That is a sobering correction, because it means the danger zone is wider than we thought. The edge is closer than the textbook said, and these were the strongest test subjects you could pick. For an elderly person, for someone with heart disease or diabetes, for an infant the line sits lower still. The theoretical 35 was always the limit for the toughest possible human under ideal conditions. The real-world line for real-world people arrives sooner. It helps to make this concrete, because the abstraction of wet bulb degrees can hide how close the edge really is. The reason a humid 105 degrees is so much more punishing than a dry 105 is that the heat index is built precisely to capture how much the moisture in the air sabotages your sweat. In dry desert air, a thermometer reading of 105 degrees might correspond to a heat index barely above the air temperature, because your sweat evaporates freely and does real cooling work, and crucially, at night, that desert temperature collapses and your body gets its recovery. In the saturated marine air of South Florida, that same 105 on the thermometer can correspond to a far higher heat index and a far higher wet bulb temperature, because the air is so full of water that your sweat just beads and drips and does almost nothing, and then the night refuses to fall. The number on the thermometer is identical. The load on your body is in a different universe, and the people for whom that load tips from dangerous to deadly are not marathon runners pushing themselves in the sun. They are ordinary people sitting still in hot rooms, the elderly whose ability to sweat and to sense their own overheating declines with age, the people on medications that interfere with temperature regulation, the very young whose bodies have less capacity to shed heat, all of them crossing their personal version of that measured line well below the textbook figure of 35. Now bring it back to that Florida forecast and to the heat index value the Climate Prediction Center flagged, which was 105 degrees or higher. The heat index and the wet bulb temperature are not the same measurement, but they are cousins, both built to capture the same truth. That temperature alone lies to you when the air is wet. A dry 105 degrees in Arizona is a genuinely different and more survivable thing than a humid 105 degrees in Miami, because in the desert your sweat still works, and at night the land lets the temperature crash. In Florida, the same number on the heat index comes wrapped in saturated marine air where your sweat barely evaporates, and it comes on a night that, as we have seen, may not cool at all. The number is the same, the danger is not. A humid 105 that never breaks overnight is closer to that measured human limit than almost anyone scrolling past the forecast understands. This is the quiet reason the Florida version of this heat is categorically more dangerous than the dry continental heat domes that have crossed the country this spring. It is not that Florida's afternoon numbers are higher. They're often lower than what the desert southwest or the southern plains can post. It is that Florida's heat attacks the exact mechanism the body relies on, the evaporation of sweat, by drowning the air in moisture, and then it removes the recovery window by holding the night warm. High humidity sabotages your cooling during the day, and the warm ocean sabotages your reset at night. The afternoon number tells you almost nothing. The combination of moisture and a flawless night tells you everything, and it is exactly that combination the surrounding ocean creates. So we have followed the heat from a map drawn 2 weeks early, down through the physics of why a peninsula cannot cool, into the warm reservoir of the sea, into the human body and the hard line it cannot cross. But the heat is not only a threat to people. It is about to settle over one of the strangest and most fragile landscapes in North America, a place that is supposed to be underwater right now, and is instead bone dry. And what happens when this kind of heat meets? That kind of drought is a hazard that the people who manage that land are watching with real unease. To see it, we have to go into the Everglades. Part 8. A heat dome over a drying swamp. There is something genuinely strange happening at the bottom of the Florida peninsula right now, and you can find it stated plainly in the same forecast discussions that flagged the heat. The Everglades, the great subtropical wetland that covers much of South Florida, the largest of its kind on the continent, is in extreme drought. Sit with how odd that is. We are talking about a place defined by water, a slow sheet of it creeping south across the grass toward the sea, a landscape whose entire character is wetness, and it is parched, going into what is normally its rainy season. dry enough that the weather service is openly hoping the afternoon storms might bring it some relief. And now, into that already dried out wetland, a high pressure system is forecast to settle and bake it under a week of extreme heat. Drought and heat arriving together on a swamp. These two hazards do not just add together, they feed each other in a loop that makes both worse. When the land is wet, a great deal of the sun's energy goes into evaporating that water rather than heating the air, and that evaporation acts as a natural air conditioner for the whole landscape, the same way sweat cools your skin. A healthy wet Everglades fights back against heat by pouring its moisture into the sky. But a drought strips that defense away. With the water gone and the soils dried out, there is nothing left to evaporate, so all of the sun's energy goes straight into heating the ground and the air above it. The drought makes the heat hotter, and the heat, in turn, accelerates the drought, baking the last moisture out of the soil and the vegetation, drawing the wetland further down. Each one is the other's amplifier. The dry ground bakes hotter, and the hotter air dries the ground faster. And the stakes of a drying Everglades reach well beyond the marsh itself, because that wetland is not just scenery, it is infrastructure. The slow sheet of water moving south through the Everglades is part of what recharges the aquifer that millions of people in South Florida drink from, and it is the nursery for an entire web of life. The wading birds, the fish, the alligators, the whole machinery of one of the most distinctive ecosystems on the continent. When that system dries out, the soil underneath it, which is largely peat, the accumulated organic matter of thousands of years, becomes vulnerable in a way ordinary dirt is not. Dried peat can burn underground, smouldering for weeks in fires that are extraordinarily hard to put out, releasing the carbon stored over millennia and damaging the very foundation of the wetland. So a heat dome settling over a drought-stricken Everglades is not just a fire risk in the ordinary sense. It is a threat to the water supply, to the wildlife, and to the literal ground the ecosystem is built on, all of it driven by the same stalled, moisture-starved, ocean-influenced pattern that is taking the nights away from the cities. One pattern, and it reaches into the drinking water and the bedrock as surely as it reaches into the bedroom, and there is a third hazard waiting at the end of that loop, one that almost no one associates with a swamp, and it is fire. A drought-dried wetland packed with dead and desiccated vegetation, and then baked under extreme heat, becomes something the Everglades is not built, in our imagination, to be. It becomes fuel. We have talked on this channel in recent weeks about how in a drought-hardened landscape the ignition source almost stops mattering, because when the fuel is dry enough, anything will set it off. A lightning strike from one of those afternoon storms, a spark, a careless moment. The Everglades has burned before, and a hot, dry early summer is exactly the recipe for it. So the same dome of high pressure that threatens people in the cities with flawless nights is, at the same time, loading a fire risk into a wetland that is supposed to be too wet to burn. One pattern, stacking hazard upon hazard, each one feeding the next. Step back and notice that this is the same story we have been telling from the beginning, just told in the language of the land instead of the people. The ocean heat that will not let Miami cool at night is part of the same warm, high-pressure, dominated, moisture-starved pattern that is drying and baking the Everglades by day. The heat wave is not happening to the people and separately to the swamp. It is one event expressing itself through every vulnerable system it touches, the human body in an upstairs apartment and the cracked peat of a drying marsh alike. That is the through line. The energy is in the ocean and the atmosphere, and it is spending itself across the whole peninsula at once. And the warning that this can reach a genuinely catastrophic extreme is not hypothetical, because we watched the marine version of it play out 3 years ago, in the water at the very edge of these same Everglades. Recall that buoy in Manatee Bay, the one that read 101.1 degrees in the summer of 2023. That reading happened right there, in the shallow waters at the bottom of the peninsula, at the boundary between the wetland and the sea. And recall what that same heat did just offshore down in the Keys, where an entire restored reef section at Sombrero Reef died, 100% mortality, in a single hot season. The land version of crossing a line that life cannot come back from is a wetland that dries and burns. The ocean version is a reef that bleaches white and dies. Both are the same event, the same stored heat, finding the most fragile thing in reach and pushing it past the point of return. In 2023, the water crossed that line. The question hanging over this summer is how close the land and the sea come to crossing it again, earlier in the year, with the reservoir already loaded. So we have now seen the heat reach the body and the wetland and the reef. But there is a layer underneath all of it that we have only touched, a reason this particular June is loaded the way it is, a set of larger forces that have been tilting the whole system toward this for years, and it is also the layer where the loudest and least accurate explanations live, the theories about who is doing this and why, the claims that the heat is manufactured, the insistence that it is all perfectly normal and you are being lied to. To finish the picture honestly, we have to go down to that deepest layer, sort the real engine from the noise, and see what is actually driving a planet where a forecast like this one keeps arriving earlier every year. Part 9. The deeper engine and the noise. There is a reason the ocean around Florida is loaded the way it is, and part of that reason sits on the far side of the planet, in the equatorial Pacific. We have followed this on the channel for weeks now, the slow tilt of the Pacific toward El Niño, that recurring warming of the central and eastern tropical Pacific that reorganizes weather patterns across the entire globe. As of the latest readings, the index that tracks it sits at plus 0.48, officially still in neutral territory but climbing, with the warming trend pointed straight at the threshold and the forecasts calling for it to strengthen as the year goes on. We are talking about a Pacific that is 0.02 of a degree away from crossing the line into a formal El Niño, at the exact moment the Atlantic and the Gulf are running near record warm. The world's two great ocean basins are warming in concert, and a planet with both of its major oceans loaded at once is a planet where a forecast like this Florida one stops being a freak event and starts being the kind of thing that shows up earlier and more often. And underneath even that sits the slowest engine of all, the one that almost never makes it into a 2-week forecast because it moves on the scale of decades. The entire baseline has shifted. The planet now runs roughly 1.3 degrees Celsius warmer than it did before the industrial era, and that number is not an abstraction when you're talking about heat events. It is the new floor that every pattern builds on top of. When a ridge of high pressure parks over Florida now, it is parking over an ocean and an atmosphere that start the game warmer than they used to, so the same weather pattern that might have produced an ordinary hot spell decades ago now produces a record one. The dice are the same dice. The atmosphere still rolls them. But the whole table has been tilted so the high numbers come up more often, and the records that fall are the records of a warmer world. That is why the forecasts keep arriving earlier, why the oceans keep hitting marks they have never hit, why a wetland is in drought going into its rainy season. The background has moved, and everything plays out on top of it. Now, because the background has moved, and because people can feel it, this is exactly the territory where the loud and inaccurate explanations rush in, and this channel has never been in the business of pretending those theories do not exist. We are in the business of taking them seriously enough to actually check them, so let us check them. The first one you will hear, every single time a forecast like this goes out, is that the heat is being manufactured deliberately, that some facility, often the one called HAARP, is cooking the atmosphere on purpose. And I understand the instinct. When you see coordinated forecasts and official maps and agencies all saying the same thing, it can feel like there must be coordination behind the weather itself. But the numbers end the argument before it starts. A continental scale heat dome involves an amount of energy on the order of 10 to the 22nd joules. A facility like HAARP radiates a few million watts. The gap between those two numbers is something like 15 orders of magnitude, a factor of 1,000 trillion. You cannot heat an ocean basin with a radio transmitter, any more than you can boil the sea with a hairdryer. And the actual mechanism, a ridge of high pressure sitting over water that is already near record warm, is openly modelled and published, available to anyone who wants to read it. The real explanation is not hidden. It is just less dramatic than the manufactured one, and far larger. And that, honestly, is part of why the manufactured explanations are so appealing. A secret weapon is, in a strange way, a more comforting story than the truth, because a weapon implies a hand on a switch, someone in control, something that could in principle be turned off. The real answer is harder to sit with precisely because no one is steering it. There is no switch. There is just an enormous volume of water that has absorbed a steadily growing amount of heat over decades and is now beginning to spend it, governed by physics that does not negotiate and cannot be switched off by exposing a culprit. The conspiracy offers a villain. The data offers a system, vast and slow and indifferent, and a system is much harder to be angry at and much harder to look away from. But it is the system that is real, and it is the system that drew that red shape over Florida. The second thing you will hear is the opposite, that the authorities are hiding how bad it is, downplaying the danger to keep people calm. And here the evidence runs exactly the other direction. The Climate Prediction Center did not bury this. They published an extreme heat hazard across an entire state a week to 2 weeks in advance, in public, with the probability stamped right on the map. And the single most alarming detail in the whole outlook, the line about record high minimum temperatures and little overnight relief, was something they volunteered. Nobody forced that sentence into the forecast. They wrote it because it is the most dangerous part, and they wanted it seen. That is not the behaviour of an agency concealing a threat. That is the behaviour of one waving a flag as early and as clearly as the science allows. Then there is the third reaction, and this one is the most reasonable of the three, so it deserves the most respect. It is the person who says, look, Florida's hot every summer, this is normal, and the media just loves to scare everyone. And honestly, part of that is fair. Florida is hot in June. A single forecast is not the apocalypse, and anyone selling you the end of the world on the back of one weather map is not worth your time. But here is where the honest version of that skepticism has to reckon with the specific, checkable facts. Near-record ocean temperatures in the surrounding water measured, a statewide extreme heat flag drawn 2 weeks out, which is unusual, documented. An emphasis on record overnight minimums rather than afternoon highs, which is the fingerprint of an ocean-driven event rather than a normal summer, and a baseline that has measurably shifted under the whole thing. Normal Florida summer is a real concept, but it now sits on a hotter floor than it did a generation ago, and the thing the data is showing is precisely that the floor has moved. So the skeptic is half right. This is Florida being Florida. It is just that Florida itself is not the Florida it used to be. And the last one, the idea that the sun is behind it, that some surge in solar activity is cooking us, falls apart on the measurements just as cleanly. The sun's total energy output varies by only about 0.1% across its cycle, enough to nudge global temperature by around 1/10 of a degree, nowhere near a record marine heatwave. And as anyone who follows this channel's space weather coverage knows, the sun through this stretch has been relatively quiet on that front. The energy reorganizing Florida's summer did not come from a solar surge. It came from the ocean, which had been quietly storing it for months. Every one of these theories, when you actually run the numbers, points back to the same unglamorous, enormous answer. The water is warm, the background has shifted, and the ocean is the engine, which is exactly where we have been pointing since the first minute, and exactly where the whole picture finally comes together, because once you accept that the ocean is the engine, this single week in June stops being a weather event and becomes something much more like a gauge reading on the entire summer ahead. Part 10. Why 1 week is a preview of 3 months. Here is where all of it converges, so let me draw the lines together into a single shape. Everything we have looked at, the flawless nights, the loaded hurricane fuel, the wet bulb danger, the drying Everglades, the shifted baseline, comes down to one physical fact. The ocean around Florida is holding an enormous charge of heat, earlier in the year and at a higher level than almost ever recorded, and the entire summer is going to be the story of how that charge gets spent. That is what makes a single week in the middle of June a genuine preview of the next 3 months. You're not looking at an isolated hot spell, you're looking at the fuel gauge, and the needle is buried. Think about what it means that the reservoir is already this loaded in June. In a normal year, the Gulf and the Atlantic build their heat gradually through the summer, reaching their warmest in late August and September, which is exactly why that is the peak of hurricane season and the most relentless stretch of summer heat. The water needs the whole season to charge up, but this year the battery is already near full in June, months ahead of schedule. That does not mean the summer has peaked. It means the summer is starting from a level it normally takes until late August to reach, and it still has the entire season of additional heating in front of it. When you start that far ahead, every pattern that comes along has more to work with. Every high-pressure ridge that parks over the state finds an ocean already primed to deny the nights their cooling. Every tropical system that wanders into the Gulf finds fuel already stacked deep in the water. The loaded June reservoir is not the climax. It is the opening position, and it is a frightening one to open from. To feel the difference, imagine 2 summers starting from 2 different opening positions. In an ordinary year, June is the warm-up. The ocean is pleasant but not yet primed, the heat events are real but breakable, the hurricane fuel is still being assembled, and the genuinely dangerous stretch is months away, giving everyone time to ease into it. The system builds gradually toward its late summer peak, and the peak, when it comes, is the product of a whole season of slow charging. Now imagine starting that same summer with the ocean already at the temperature it would normally reach at that late peak. You have not removed the summer's worth of additional heating that is still to come. You have simply moved the starting line forward so that the conditions that normally define the most dangerous weeks of the year are present from the opening, with the entire season of further charging still stacked on top. That is the position the Gulf and the Atlantic are opening from this year. The summer is not starting at the bottom of the hill. It is starting partway up it, with the same climb still ahead. And a season that begins where other seasons end is a season with a higher ceiling than the calendar alone would suggest. So the ocean has 2 ways to spend that stored heat, and we have now seen both of them. It can spend it slowly, leaking it into the air night after night, producing exactly the kind of stalled, recovery-denying heat that the Climate Prediction Centre flagged. The flawless nights that strain the body and quietly run up a death toll in the dark. That is the slow burn, the patient version, the one that does not make the national news because it does not look like a disaster. It just looks like summer that never lets go. Or the ocean can spend that same heat all at once, dumping it into the core of a storm that crosses one of those deep warm eddies in the Gulf and explodes from a modest system into a monster in a single day. The violent version, the one that does make the news, the one that arrives with a name and a landfall and a scar you can photograph. Same reservoir, same stored energy. 2 completely different ways out. And which one we get depends on patterns of wind and timing that nobody can pin down 2 weeks ahead, let alone 2 months. This is why the honest forecast for the summer is not a single confident prediction, but a recognition of a loaded system. We know the fuel is there, more of it and earlier than almost ever before. We know the slow spend has already begun, because that is what the Florida heat outlook is. And we know the violent spend is being held back, for now, only by the wind shear that the developing El Niño is throwing across the Atlantic, a break that suppresses the number of storms but does nothing to limit the strength of any single one that finds a gap. The summer ahead is not written, but the starting conditions are, and they are the conditions of an ocean carrying an unusually heavy charge into a season that still has months of heating left to add to it. That is the preview. The June heat is the first withdrawal from an account that is fuller than it should be. And notice how this reframes every one of the recent patterns we have covered, because it ties them into a single ongoing story rather than a string of separate alarms. The first big continental heat wave of the summer that we talked about just days ago. The El Niño building in the Pacific that we covered last week. The marine heat that has been simmering in these waters. They are not separate events competing for your attention. They are all expressions of the same loaded system, the same warm oceans, the same shifted baseline, the same enormous charge of stored heat looking for ways to spend itself across a hot season. The Florida forecast is simply the place where that system shows its hand earliest and most clearly, because Florida, surrounded by water on every side, is the most sensitive instrument we have. It is the canary, and the peninsula is the cage, and when the canary starts struggling in the middle of June, the honest thing to do is not to look away. It is to ask what the rest of the cage is about to feel. There is one last thing to understand before we close, and it is the part that turns all of this from a story about a hot week into a story about something that is genuinely changing underneath us. Because the most important number in that entire forecast was never the afternoon high, it was the overnight low, and the slow, quiet rise of the nighttime floor, the warming of the dark hours that the ocean is driving, is rewriting what a heat wave even is, in a way that almost no one is tracking, and in a way that may matter more for human survival than any record afternoon temperature ever will. That is where we have to finish, with the night, and with the line that the planet is quietly redrawing while we're all still watching the wrong number. Part 11. The front line has moved to the dark. For as long as people have talked about heat, we have measured it by its peak. The high temperature of the day is the number that goes on the news, the number people compare, the number records are kept on. How hot did it get? That is the question everyone asks, and it makes intuitive sense, because the afternoon is when the heat hurts the most while you're awake to feel it. But the science of who actually lives and who actually dies in a heat wave has been pointing, for years now, at a different number entirely, the one nobody puts on the Chiron, the overnight low. And there is a slow global shift underway that almost no one outside the field is tracking, which is that across much of the planet the nighttime temperatures are rising faster than the daytime ones. Let me explain why that asymmetry happens, because it ties directly back to everything we have said about Florida. The daytime high is driven mostly by the sun, and the sun has not gotten brighter. But the nighttime low is driven by how easily the accumulated heat can escape after dark, and that escape is exactly what a warmer, moister, more energetic atmosphere interferes with. More water vapour in the air, more heat stored in nearby oceans, more of the day's warmth trapped against the ground overnight, all of it pushes the nighttime minimum up. So as the planet warms, the floor of the night rises faster than the ceiling of the day. The heat is not just getting hotter at its peak, it is losing its ability to let go, and the losing happens in the dark. This is not a hunch or a projection. It is one of the most consistently observed signatures in the entire temperature record. Across large parts of the world, when you separate out the daytime highs from the nighttime lows and track them over the decades, the nighttime lows climb faster. The gap between the hot afternoon and the cool night has been narrowing, because the nights are warming up toward the days more quickly than the days are climbing away from the nights. And it makes perfect physical sense once you see why, because the daytime maximum is set largely by incoming sunlight that has not changed, while the nighttime minimum is set by how freely the accumulated heat can escape, which a warmer, moister, more energetic atmosphere directly throttles. The fingerprint of a warming world is not really a hotter afternoon, it is a warmer night, and the places that feel it first and hardest are the warm, humid, ocean-adjacent ones, the tropics and the subtropics, where the air is already moist and the water is already close, which is to say places shaped exactly like the Florida peninsula. Florida is not an outlier in this trend, it is a leading indicator of it. Florida, wrapped in its warming ocean, is simply one of the first and clearest places on Earth where that shift becomes impossible to ignore, because the ocean drives the nighttime floor up harder there than almost anywhere else. And this matters enormously, because the night is where the body was always supposed to recover, and the night is where the recovery is being taken away. We built our entire intuition about surviving heat around the assumption that you endure the hot afternoon and then the evening brings relief. Every cooling strategy, every old building designed to dump its heat after dark, every cultural habit of resting through the worst of the day, all of it assumed the night would come to the rescue. As the nighttime floor rises, that assumption quietly fails, and it fails invisibly, because no one is watching the 3 a.m. temperature. They are watching the afternoon high, which might not even set a record, while the genuinely dangerous number, the low that will not fall, climbs past its own records in the dark where no headline finds it. That is what the Climate Prediction Center was really telling you when they wrote record high minimum temperatures possible. They were telling you the front line of this hazard has moved to the night, and the night is exactly where we are not looking. Consider what a warming night does beyond the human body, because the effects reach into systems we depend on without thinking. Crops and livestock need the nighttime cool to recover from the heat of the day just as we do, and persistently warm nights stress agriculture in ways that hot afternoons alone do not. Infrastructure built to shed its heat overnight, from power systems to the buildings themselves, runs under continuous strain when the cooling never comes. The electricity grid, which usually gets a break in demand after dark, instead faces air conditioners running flat out all night long, exactly when the system expected to rest, which is when the risk of failure climbs, and the failure would strand people in the heat with no way to cool down. A warm night is not a smaller version of a hot day. It is a different kind of stress, applied to the recovery window of every system that assumed it would get to cool off, and it is precisely the kind of stress that the surrounding ocean is about to impose on Florida. This is the quiet reframing that the Florida forecast forces, if you actually read it the way the forecasters wrote it. The story of heat in a warming world is, increasingly, not the story of the hottest afternoon. It is the story of the night that will not cool, and the night that will not cool is an ocean story, because it is the water, more than the sun, that controls the floor. Florida has the warmest, closest, most encircling water of any heavily populated place in the country, which is why Florida is where you see it first and see it worst. The peninsula is not an exception to the warming world. It is the preview of it, the place where the future of heat, the flawless night, arrives early enough and clearly enough that a federal agency will draw it on a map 2 weeks ahead of time. So if the front line has moved to the dark, the obvious question is what a person actually does with that knowledge, beyond worry. Because understanding a threat is only useful if it changes what you watch and what you do. And the good news, the genuinely empowering part of this whole story, is that this is a hazard we've already proven we can survive better when we see it coming. So before we close, let me give you the concrete things to actually watch over the next 3 months, the specific signals that will tell you which way this loaded ocean is going to spend its heat, so that you are reading the same instruments the forecasters are reading, instead of waiting for the headline that arrives too late. Part 12. What to watch over. The next 3 months. The first thing to watch is the one the forecast already pointed at, and it is the overnight low, not the afternoon high. When this heat settles over Florida in the back half of June, do not just look at how hot it gets in the day. Look at what the temperature falls to at night, and specifically whether it sets records for how high it stays. A string of nights where the low never drops into comfortable territory, where it holds in the upper 70s or the 80s, hour after hour, is the real signal that the ocean has taken the night's cooling away, and it is the condition under which the danger to vulnerable people climbs the fastest. The night that will not cool is the single most important thing to track, and now you know why. You are watching the floor because the floor is where the ocean shows its hand. The second thing to watch is the temperature of the water itself, because the water is the engine, and its reading tells you how much fuel is in the system. Sea surface temperatures across the Gulf of Mexico and the Western Atlantic are tracked continuously and published openly, and through the rest of the summer the question is whether they hold at the near-record levels they have already reached, or climb even higher as the season's heating piles on top of an already loaded reservoir. If that water stays near record warm through July and August, then both the slow spend and the violent spend remain fully fueled, the heat waves stay loaded and the hurricane fuel stays stacked. The ocean temperature is the master gauge, everything else is downstream of it, and the good news is that you do not need special access to watch it, because these sea surface readings are published openly and updated constantly, the same data the forecasters themselves are reading. You can watch the same gauge they watch. When you hear, later in the summer, that the Gulf has cooled back toward normal, that is genuine relief, the tank draining down. And when you hear that it is holding near record warm into the depths of the season, that is the signal to stay alert, because it means both the slow spend and the violent spend remain fully fueled. The water is the one number that sits upstream of everything else in this story, and it is a number anyone can follow. The third thing to watch, specifically for the violent version, is the Gulf and that loop current. Watch for one of those deep warm eddies pinching off and parking in the middle of the basin during the heart of the season, because that is the rapid intensification fuel depot, and watch for any stretch where the wind shear that El Niño has been throwing across the Atlantic relaxes, even for a few days. The dangerous setup is not a busy season. It is a single storm finding a quiet window in the shear and then crossing one of those warm eddies on its way toward land. A below-normal forecast can still contain that storm. The count being low does not lower the ceiling on the worst one, and the worst one is the only one that matters to the place it hits. So a quiet season is not a reason to look away from the Gulf. It is a reason to watch the few systems that do form even more closely. The fourth thing to watch is the land, and specifically the Everglades and the drought. Watch whether those afternoon storms the Weather Service is hoping for actually arrive and break the drought, or whether the wetland keeps drying under the heat. A South Florida that stays in drought through a baking summer is a fire risk in a place we do not think of as flammable, and it is also a sign that the larger pattern, the high pressure, and the moisture starvation is locking in rather than breaking. The state of the Everglades is a readout on whether the dome is a passing event or a settled regime, and a drying swamp under a heat dome is the land telling you the same thing the flawless night is telling you, that the system is loaded and not letting go. And the fifth thing, the one that ties it all together, is to hold the whole picture as a single connected system, rather than a series of separate alarms, because that is the entire advantage this kind of understanding gives you. When you see a heat advisory go out for Florida, you will know it is not just a hot day, it is the ocean spending its charge slowly. When you see a tropical system spin up in the Gulf, you will know it is the same reservoir threatening to spend that charge all at once. When you hear that the hurricane season is forecast to be quiet, you will know that quiet means fewer storms, not a weaker worst case, and you will keep your eye on the fuel rather than the count. You will be reading the instruments instead of waiting for the disaster, and that, more than anything, is what keeps people alive through a hazard like this. The cities that do best in extreme heat are not the ones with the mildest weather. They are the ones that saw it coming and understood what they were looking at. And on the most personal level, the level of a single household, the understanding translates into a few simple things that genuinely save lives during a stretch like the one being forecast. The people who come through these events are very often the people someone checked on. An older relative or neighbour living alone, in an apartment that will not cool, who may not even register how overheated they are getting because the body's sense of its own temperature dulls with age, is exactly the person a phone call or a knock on the door can pull back from the edge. Knowing where the air conditioning is, a public cooling place, a library, a mall, a friend's home, and actually going there during the worst of it, is not weakness. It is the single most effective thing a person without reliable cooling can do. And learning to recognize when heat has stopped being uncomfortable and started being dangerous, the confusion, the stopping of sweat, the racing heart, the dizziness, is the difference between a problem caught early and an emergency caught too late. None of that requires a forecast degree or a government program. It requires knowing that the night is the dangerous part, knowing who around you is most exposed to it, and not looking away during the stretch when the heat refuses to break. Because here is the thing this whole forecast really represents. When you strip away the map and the probability and the careful agency language, it is a piece of advance warning, issued early and in public, about an ocean that is carrying more heat into a summer than it has in almost any year on record. We have been given the warning, we have been told 2 weeks ahead that the nights are going to stop cooling, and we have been told why. The only question left is the one the science cannot answer for us, the one that depends on what that warm water does with all its stored energy over the months ahead, and on whether we are paying attention to the right number when it does. And that question is where everything we have walked through finally points. Part 13, the summer that arrives earlier every year. There is a pattern hiding inside all of this that is easy to miss when you look at any single forecast, and it only becomes visible when you step back and watch the calendar. These events keep arriving earlier. The records keep moving toward the front of the year. A few summers ago, the talk of record ocean heat and dangerous overnight lows belonged to late July and August, the deep middle of the season, when the water had spent months charging up and finally reached its peak. Now we're talking about it in the third week of June, with a federal agency confident enough to flag it 2 weeks before that. The thing that used to be a late summer story is becoming an early summer story, and the reason is exactly the one we have been circling. The ocean is starting each year warmer, so it reaches the dangerous threshold sooner, so the summer that used to wait until August now shows up in June. Picture what one of these nights actually feels like, because the statistics can numb you to the human reality of it, and the human reality is the entire point. It is 2 a.m. in an apartment on an upper floor in a city in South Florida. The sun has been down for 7 hours. Every instinct you have, every bit of inherited expectation built into your body says it should be cooler now, that the relief should have come. But the air in the room sits at the same thick, heavy warmth it held at sunset, because outside, the ocean a few miles away is still radiating its stored heat into the air, and the concrete of the city is still giving back the warmth it soaked up all day, and the moisture in the air is holding the day's heat against the ground like a lid. The temperature on the thermometer reads a number that would have been a daytime figure a generation ago, and it is the middle of the night. If the air conditioning is running, you are paying for it, and the grid is straining under everyone else doing the same. If it is not running because it broke, or because you cannot afford it, or because the power went out, then there is nowhere in that room for the heat to go, and there is nowhere in your body for it to go either, because the night that was supposed to carry it away has refused. That is the lived experience of a flawless night, and it is the experience the Climate Prediction Centre was quietly warning about when they wrote that one sentence. It does not photograph like a disaster. There is no funnel cloud, no storm surge, no wall of flame. There is just a room that will not cool and a body that cannot rest, repeated across thousands of rooms, night after night, until somewhere in that stretch the most vulnerable people, the old, the sick, the very young, the ones whose hearts were already working at the edge, quietly do not make it to morning. This is why heat is the deadliest weather hazard in the country and the least visible. It kills in the dark, in private, one strained heart at a time, and it does its worst work precisely during the hours we have all been trained to think of as safe. And the thing that should focus your attention is that the trend is not toward this getting rarer. Every piece of the machinery we have examined points the same direction. The oceans are warming and loading earlier. The baseline keeps shifting upward. The nighttime floor keeps rising faster than the daytime ceiling. Each of those is a slow, massive, hard-to-reverse process, the kind that does not swing back next year. So the forecast over Florida is not a fluke to be endured and forgotten. It is a data point on a line, and the line is sloping towards summers that start hotter, load faster, and take their cooling away earlier in the year. The peninsula is showing us, in June, what more and more of the warm, humid, ocean-adjacent parts of the world are going to be shown later, and what they will be shown earlier and earlier as the years go on. And this is why it is a mistake to file a forecast like this one under the heading of just another hot summer and move on. A single hot summer is weather. A pattern of hot summers that begin earlier each year, loaded by oceans that charge faster each year, sitting on a baseline that climbs each decade, is something else. It is a trend with a direction, and the direction is consistent across every independent line of evidence we have: the sea temperatures, the overnight minimums, the timing of the marine heat waves, the state of the wetlands. None of those is a forecast that could be wrong by next Tuesday. They are measurements of where the system already is. So when the Climate Prediction Centre draws that red shape over Florida in the third week of June, the honest way to read it is not as an isolated event to be endured, but as a single frame pulled from a film that has been running for years and is speeding up. The frame is alarming on its own. The film is the real story, and Florida, sitting in its warm water with its sensitive nights, is simply where the film is playing first. But none of this is a reason for despair, and I want to be clear about that, because despair is useless, and it is also not warranted by the facts. We already saw the proof. Miami took the worst of this kind of heat and kept its death toll to a handful, while other places counted theirs in the hundreds, and the difference was not luck or climate. It was understanding. It was a city that decided to treat the flawless night as the deadly hazard it is, that lowered its warning thresholds and mapped its vulnerable people, and got cooling to them before the night stacked up. The hazard is real, and it is growing, but it is also, almost uniquely among the disasters this channel covers, one that human attention and human systems can genuinely blunt. An earthquake gives no warning. A heat wave gives 2 weeks. The entire difference between a record on a chart and a quiet tragedy in an upstairs room is whether anyone was watching the right number and acting on it. That is the strange mercy buried inside this forecast. We were warned. We were warned early, and in public, and in detail. What remains is what we do with the warning. Which brings us all the way back to where we started, to that red shape drawn across an entire state 2 weeks before the heat arrives, and to the single question that the science can lay out for us but cannot answer on its own. The ocean is loaded, the warning has been issued, and the only thing left undecided is what all that stored heat does next, and whether we are paying attention to the right thing while it decides. Part 14. The heat is the readout. The ocean is the engine. Let me bring this all the way home, because by now the shape of the whole thing should be clear, and it is not the shape most people see when they glance at a heat forecast. We started with what looked like an ordinary warning, a hot week coming to a place that is famously hot, and we ended somewhere else entirely, standing in front of an ocean that is carrying more heat into a summer than it has in almost any year on record, with a peninsula sitting in the middle of it like an instrument dropped into a furnace, reading out the temperature of something far larger than itself. The heat that is coming to Florida is real, and it is dangerous, and the flawless nights will hurt the people who are least equipped to endure them. But the heat itself was never the deepest part of the story. The heat is the readout. The ocean is the engine. That distinction is the whole reason this single week in June is a preview of the next 3 months. If the heat were just the air, just a high-pressure ridge that would build and break and be forgotten, then it would tell you nothing about August. But because the heat is the surface expression of an enormous reservoir of stored ocean energy, it tells you almost everything. It tells you the reservoir is loaded months ahead of schedule. It tells you the slow spend has already begun, in the form of nights that will not cool. It tells you the violent spend, the storm that crosses the warm Gulf and explodes toward a coast, is fueled and waiting, held back for now only by a pattern of wind that can change. The forecast is a gauge reading, and the gauge says the tank is full and the season has barely started. And here, finally, is the core of it, the question that all of this leaves you holding. We have learned to watch the wrong number. We watch the afternoon high, the peak, the moment of maximum discomfort while we are awake to complain about it. But the planet has been quietly moving the danger to the night, to the floor that will not fall, to the dark hours when the ocean refuses to let the heat go and the body never gets its reset. The most important number in that entire forecast was the one almost no one will read, the overnight low, the record warm minimum, the night that will not end. The question is not whether Florida will be hot in late June. Of course it will. The question is what it means that the sea around it is now warm enough, this early, to take the night itself away, and whether we will keep watching the wrong number while the ocean, patient and enormous and almost full, decides over the next 3 months exactly how it intends to spend all of that stored heat. Because the water is the story. The water has always been the story, and right now, off every coast of that peninsula, it is hotter than it has almost ever been, in the middle of June, with the whole summer still ahead. That is not a forecast about a hot week. That is the ocean showing its hand early and telling anyone willing to read it exactly what the next 3 months are made of.